All right, welcome to the Janus Project. We are continuing to work our way through all sorts of information, and so we have covered a little bit of Genesis, just a smidge, and we are going to keep working our way through some of this material. Now, for those of you who are new with us, I would suggest going back and just kind of perusing specifically episode 1, probably a little bit of episode 2 to get yourself up to speed. What we've been doing is we've been doing this thing called systematic theology for non-Christians. The idea is I'm trying to explain the theology of the Bible, and I'm trying to do it in a way that someone who is completely brand new would understand. So we talked a little bit about in episode 2 some of the characteristics that make someone a Christian. Now, there are those who would say, well, that's a fallacy. You can't just arbitrarily do that. And what I came back and I said in that episode, it's the no true Scotsman fallacy, if you're familiar with it. What I did in that episode is I showed that you have to make distinctions in order to explain what makes something unique. So Christianity is separate from a lot of different religions because there are certain things you must believe. Now, if you choose not to believe those, okay, that's your business. It means you're not a Christian, though. All right? And so what we've been doing is we've been walking through some of those characteristics, some of those non-arbitrary distinctions. Okay, that's the key word. It's not an arbitrary thing. It actually has a purpose. And so we walked through that a little bit. We talked a little bit about God and some of the names for God, some of the character traits of God, and I think some of the ones that are really, really important. We're going to get into a tad bit of apologetics today. Apologetics, if you remember from a previous episode, is giving an answer for why you believe what you believe. That's the purpose of apologetics. It's a whole field of study where you give an answer for why you believe what you believe. Okay? So, one of the questions that arises a lot of times is as people study out the doctrine of God, which is theology, as they study out the doctrine of God, they ask, sarcastically a lot of times, well, could an all-powerful God create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it? Okay, I don't know if you've ever heard that one. I've heard it. Okay, and so they ask, because God is considered all-powerful, can he do that? Now, the obvious problem there is if God can't create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it, then it means he can't do everything. Or if he creates a rock that's so heavy that he can't lift it, that also proves he can't do everything. And so it's kind of like, I got you coming or going. Ha ha ha, gotcha. This is where I hope our dialogue can get. Do you realize that people who have been defending and espousing Christianity for the last 2,000 years are not idiots? They're not stupid people. Now, I know like movies and shows like to show them being like the hick that's like, okay, that's not, I mean, there are some stupid Christians, but some really, really great philosophers through the years, some really, really great thinkers, some really, really great just storytellers have been Christian. They're not stupid. You don't think, like, do you really think they'd be taken down by something like that? Let me give you a brief explanation of how this works. When we say that God is all-powerful, what we're saying is God can do anything that is in his nature to do. Okay? So the Bible actually does not teach that God can do everything. Okay? It doesn't. In fact, throughout the Bible, it repeatedly talks about things God cannot do. For instance, it'll say, God who cannot lie. Okay? So God is actually incapable of lying. And you might be like, oh, you said he could do everything. Okay, no, we didn't. Okay? God can do anything he wants to do. He can do anything that's in his nature to do. All right? So what we need to understand, and this is a really little bit drawn out answer, but what we need to understand is that when we talk about God being able to do everything, he's omnipotent, okay? When we talk about that word, all we're saying is, if God wants to do something, he can do it. Now, God will never want to sin. It's not in his nature to do it. So God cannot tell a lie. God cannot act lasciviously, to use that big fancy word. All right? He can't act in a lustful manner. It's not in his nature to do it. Okay? God has limits specifically that he's put on himself. So specifically with the nation of Israel, God puts all sorts of limits on himself. All right? He tells them, I will do this. I won't do this. I'm going to curse you if you do this. He's binding himself to their actions. He's limiting himself in a lot of ways to say, this is how I will behave. He didn't have to do that. He chose to do that. But in that way, he shows he's not omnipotent in that he can do everything, because he can't go back on his word. But he can do anything he wants to do. All right? So you understand the difference in that? And so when we talk about this idea that God could create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it, that's a paradox. It's a contradiction in terms. All right? God's not going to do that. Let me give you a dumb illustration. By definition, a three-sided figure is a triangle. God cannot make a four-sided triangle, because that would violate the very definition for what a triangle is. That makes sense? So God's not going to create a paradox. He's not going to violate his own nature. He's not going to violate his own word. All right? So those are some of the things that you need to understand when we talk about God. That's why we spent so much time talking about the word nuance, because there are aspects to belief that actually have to be thought through. I like the way one guy put it. There was a person on Twitter who was ripping on a guy and like, oh, you can't explain it simply. And he's like, I'm sorry, some of my thoughts take more than 2 sentences to express. That's true. There are certain qualities in the Bible, there are certain attributes of God that as we look at them, we're like, okay, that's deep. That's pretty deep. I can't grasp that really quickly. Okay, so that's the first little segment today. Just kind of a thought. As we deal with God, we know that God is all-powerful, okay? But that does not mean he can do anything. It means he can do anything that he wills to do, or anything that's in his nature to do. However that best helps you understand it. Now, some of the other character traits of God. We talked last week about the idea that he is a creator, okay? He is the creator of the world. Now, what does that mean? I have a collection of books behind me on the shelf. You can see that. And in those books, there are some that are from an evolutionary point of view. There's some that are from a creationist point of view. There's some that are kind of from a hybrid point of view. And so how do we deal with that? Like, what are some of the qualities that we look for to say, how do we know God designed this world? Okay? In fact, I sympathize a lot with the intelligent design movement. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink real quick. I sympathize with the intelligent design movement. I believe you can see design pretty much wherever you look, all right? For instance, I have one of my old tablets here, okay? My old tablet was a Surface, and it fell off the hood of my car and hit the ground, and so you can see some brake marks right here where the corner shattered when it hit the ground. Now, I think that's a regrettable design choice, okay? It was an accident. It was a mistake. It was something that should not have happened, but it did, and it broke this corner of the screen, and because this is a touch screen, I no longer can use it as a touch screen because the sensors are all messed up. And so I consider that regrettable. Now, there are people out there today, like Richard Dawkins, who will bring up the idea that God couldn't possibly have created the world because look at all the bad design out there. And so what he'll reference is things like, look, your windpipe and your swallowing tube, all right, your trachea and your esophagus, they're right next to each other, and there's like this little flap that blocks one from the other. That's terrible design, because if I am talking and I want to take a drink of water at the same time, I could choke. I mean, yes, you could, but the question I bring up is, how would you design it better? I mean, because we talk, and we have one mouth hole, and that mouth hole has these wonderful thing called teeth, which we have to use to chew. So would you rather have like another mouth hole, like down here, or would you rather use this mouth hole for chewing and have like a breathing hole, like a trach tube down here? You know, and how would you design it better? Or would you have two mouths, and one mouth is just for eating, and one mouth is just for drinking? What would you do differently? It's regrettable that we can't eat and breathe at the same time, but it doesn't really make a problem because we've got a nose hole. And if you're talking so fast that you try to drink and you choke on your spit, I don't see why that's God's fault. All right. I consider this a rather efficient design. All right. You've got a mouth, okay, right here. It got the lips, the cheeks. They help kind of form the words. You got the soft and hard palate, which are very, very useful in singing and arranging the proper tone to things. And so all of that's right there. But then they also do double duty as food movers, because if you didn't have cheeks, your food would just fall back out. And so the energy required to duplicate this twice so that you have all of these functions for the mouth part and all these functions for the breathing part, it seemed wasteful. And so Richard Dawkins will bring up that idea of the mouth and the esophagus and trachea and all that and say it's just a bad design because people could choke. The vast majority of people in the world have not choked to death. Okay? It does happen occasionally. But the vast majority of people in the world have figured out how to use this and they don't choke to death. So I don't consider it bad design. I consider it him not appreciating the design that's there. The other thing he brings up is he talks about the birth canal and some of that. Now, there is some evidence that perhaps there was some curse or some difficulty laid on that, and so it's the current structure is a little bit more cursed than it used to be. But even if it wasn't, how would you do it differently? I mean, you can only flare the hips out so far. You can only change the structure of the birth canal so much. What would you do? The fact is, the baby has got to be born so that it can adapt to the environment. If you guys get a chance, I'm going to challenge you to go look up this field called epigenetics. Epigenetics is this amazing new field that they're digging into, probably the last decade. And what it is you guys understand DNA. All right, so you got the DNA double helix. The DNA double helix is there, and it carries all the information for the way you are supposed to be designed. What's amazing is what they've learned is that there are times where certain chemicals will bind up certain chromosomes, which are bundles of DNA. They'll bind them up so they can't be duplicated, so that certain traits are being passed on, they just don't manifest. All right? So they may be present in your genotype, which is your genetic information, but they won't be present in your phenotype, which is your physical manifestation. So for me, I'm right now manifesting certain genetic traits that have shown up in what is called my phenotype. Okay, the simple definition for a phenotype is what is visible. That doesn't mean that's all that's there. I could have all sorts of genes hidden away that don't manifest. In fact, they may never manifest during my lifetime, but I may pass them on to my son. Okay, it might be a recessive gene, it might be a certain character trait that's bound up until a certain external stimulus hits, and then it'll activate. And so this whole field of epigenetics is studying out the effect that the environment has on your DNA. And it is astounding. It is just this fascinating field. And so I like to compare it. So if you don't know how DNA works, I want you to think of DNA like a library. Okay? I walk into this library, I'm in the reserve reading section, and I open up the library cabinet and I pull out a book, and I'm allowed to take it over to this table and I'm allowed to copy from it. Okay? So when you go into a reserve reading section, you're only allowed to use the books inside the library. Now, I can copy, handwrite this thing, pick it up, carry it out of the library, but I can't take the original with me. That's what happens in the nucleus of a cell. You've got these certain structures that will move in, they'll copy the DNA, and then they'll unzip it, make a copy, they'll leave with the copy, and then they'll go build a structure with it. So the DNA is staying in the nucleus, but copies of it keep getting brought out like blueprints so they can build these grand, awesome structures. I like to think of epigenetics as someone has come up and they've taken a padlock and they've locked up a certain cabinet and said you can't access the books in that shelf. That's pretty much what epigenetics does. It's these chemicals that will bind up the chromosome or loosen it. And so if they bind it up real tight, you can't duplicate it. If they loosen it, it means go for it. And what they've learned is that when you have a famine or when you have certain environmental situations, even sometimes when you eat certain things, it may open or close some of those genetic molecules. Absolutely astounding. And that's going on inside your body. And so they found people who grew up in areas that had a famine. And sometimes those character traits that help you survive in a famine, that help you, retain nutrients, and you may struggle with obesity if you eat too much. Those character traits could get carried on all the way to your grandkids. I mean, there's some of those traits that will activate. If you get some time, there is a certain type of mouse called an Agouti mouse. All right? Inside this Agouti mouse, and this mouse, it's going to be kind of a yellowish color, really fat. It's going to be prone to diabetes and some types of cancer, and it's just not a healthy mouse because it has this certain gene called the agouti gene. But what they found is that they can feed the mother a certain type of food rich in a molecule called a methyl group. And as they feed the mother this methyl group, what it does is it actually turns off, okay? So it's closing up this agouti gene, and the offspring come out looking pretty much like normal mice. They're no longer highly susceptible to type 2 diabetes and cancer and all of those things. And they're not obese. They're brown and they're thin. And it's so weird because genetically they are exactly the same as their parent, but that gene has been turned on and turned off. And so what God has done as a designer is he has created us with the ability where we have to come out of the birth canal well developed, okay? But also in kind of that defenseless stage because we've got to learn to adapt to the environment we're in. And that can be done, again, through epigenetics. It can be done through just exposure to the environment. There's all sorts of things that go on. And it's an absolutely astounding system that God has set up. And that's why I look, and when people say, oh, bad design, I look at them and I'm like, do you understand what you're saying? That's not bad design. Another one I love. A lot of people will bring up the idea of the eyeball, and they'll say, the eyeball, it has this light-sensitive layer known as the retina, and the blood vessels are actually between the light source and the retina. That's rough. Okay. There's plenty of reasons for it. One, the retina needs a lot of blood, so having the blood vessels right there is actually important. But what they've started to discover is that there are basically the equivalent of fiber optics that are poking through and allow the light to go through the blood vessels straight to the retinal surface. One thing I would ask you, if you don't believe in God, examine the evidence from design. Look at some of the evidence. Look at some of the fingerprints of design. And a lot of times we weren't even able to detect this stuff because we did not have the technological advancement to even understand it. Like if you don't have fiber optics invented yet, can you spot them in a cell? Do they make any sense to you? If you haven't invented the microscope, can you see the DNA and all of the things that go along there? If you have not yet discovered certain technologies and realized the absolute amazing work it took to build those technologies, can you appreciate the technologies you see inside the body? Now, one book I'm going to mention is this book right here by Perry Marshall. I've talked about it in the past. Perry Marshall has a podcast that he does quite often. It's called the Evolution 2.0 podcast. Perry Marshall has done a lot of work with sound engineering. And he realizes that when you introduce noise into a sound system, it disrupts the transmission of information. And so he says a lot of times when you have like mutations and other things, they are like introducing noise into a system. Now, he is not a pure intelligent design guy. I believe he's a Christian. From everything I've read, he seems to be a Christian. But he leans more on the evolutionary side of things and says, hey, let's find natural explanations for things. But it's neat because he explains that when you add random mutations and random chaos that is unguided, it's like adding noise to a system, and it disrupts any of the information you're trying to transfer. And those are technologies that you wouldn't understand and you wouldn't appreciate unless you had worked in that field or had someone who is knowledgeable in that field explain it to you. So as we learn more and more about technology, and as we learn more and more about science, our conclusions more and more are starting to be, there's just no way this happened by chance. Now, a lot of people will say that's a God in the gaps argument. I can't explain it, so God must have done it. No, actually, I think it's quite the opposite. What we see is we see comparisons. So I can look and say, that tablet of mine is so complicated that one little thing goes wrong in it and it breaks and it's useless. So why do I believe that my body could be completely the product of chance, when I know that if it's all completely by chance, something's going to break, and most likely when things break in our body, we die? What are the chances that this after this after this after this after this is going to go right, and I'm going to survive and pass on my genes to the next generation, and it's going to be good genes? And then they're going to survive again and again and again and again, passed on their genes. And this is completely unguided, completely accidental, completely just doing whatever is luckiest. All right? What are the chances that that happens? It's very high that it wouldn't happen. And so just as we would look around us and say, oh, I don't appreciate the fiber optics until I learn what a fiber optic is. Oh, I don't appreciate the comparison to sound transmission until I know about sound transmission. The more we're learning about science, the more we realize how far-fetched it is to believe that this stuff is happening accidentally. That's the point I'm trying to make. God of the Gaps basically says, I'm not going to study anything, I'm just going to believe God did it. No, when we approach faith as Christians, we approach faith with eyes wide open. We're looking around us going, okay, I don't quite understand how that works, but I haven't seen enough to make me doubt yet. Oh, ooh, that's a tough one right there. I don't know how to explain that. Ooh, that's a tough one there. And you know what happens? We do research. We study. We compare. And there are a lot of times that fact that we thought was so solid actually turned out to be completely wrong. And that's the thing. As you look at a book like What is Evolution? By Ernst Mayr. And I'll spend some time going through some of these points. There are things in this book, as you look at it, that sounds so convincing until you look and go, oh, that was actually proven to be a hoax at the time he wrote it. Sounds all convincing, sounds all solid, sounds all good, but you look at it and you go, oh, ooh, Haeckel's embryo drawings. Yeah, those aren't correct. Ooh. And so as you start looking through some of the things he says, you're like, yeah, that right there, that was actually a hoax. That was forged. And there's other examples like that in the book. And so as we go through, what you need to do is you need to say, what is my grounding? What am I coming back to? What is my absolute authority? Do you have one? For me, it's the Bible. But I do not approach the Bible blindly. I look at what the Bible says, I compare it to reality, and 9 times out of 10, the Bible is square on, and I know I can trust it completely. The other 1 time out of 10, I look at that and I go, you know what? Maybe I didn't understand what the Bible said there. Or maybe the Bible was being poetic. Or maybe my understanding is flawed. Or maybe science is flawed. Or the last possible conclusion is maybe the Bible's wrong, but I have yet to see a case where the Bible is wrong. Do your research. Study it out. But as we look at the idea of God as a creator, we see abundant evidence around us that he has designed. We see abundant evidence around us that the world is held together very, very well. There's so much more I could say. I don't want to make the episode go on much longer. Maybe we'll come back on a future time and cover this in more detail. But I want you guys to take some of the stuff I've talked about. Go do a little bit of research. Go do a little bit of reading. And if you were going to start in one place to figure out some of the hoaxes that evolution has perpetrated, there is a book. I don't think I have it in here, actually. There is a book, and it is called Icons of Evolution. I would challenge you, go get a copy of that book. I know I've asked you to read a lot of different books. But Icons of Evolution is going to be one of those books, especially if you're not a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you doubt this whole thing, I'm going to ask you to please go get the copy of Icons of Evolution. And I believe he's written a more recent one called Zombie Science or something, you know, when examples don't die, or things that keep coming back from the dead. And it's the same idea. It's certain things that you are taught in your science textbooks that even secular scientists say, yeah, that was shown to be a fraud. And so maybe we'll take a whole video and go through that. If you don't have time to buy the book, go watch Icons of Evolution on YouTube, because they actually have a documentary of it, and they'll demonstrate what they're talking about. But it'll talk about Haeckel's embryo drawings, which I remember my own grandfather, who was a bright man, he used that as an excuse to say why evolution was true. And at the time he was talking to me about it, it had already been proven to be a fraud for probably about 100 years. But they still use it in the textbooks. The Miller-Urey experiment that supposedly simulated the atmosphere in the early Earth. That is another example of something that did not actually prove what they say it proved. All right? Darwin's finches don't prove what Darwin thought they proved. Okay? That's just another example. Fruit flies, if you hit them with enough radiation, they will randomly generate new wings. That doesn't prove evolution. All right? And so what you need to do is again, watch the documentary if you don't believe me or if you don't know what I'm talking about. And chances are you probably had some of those examples in your science textbook. That's why I say we don't just put our faith blindly in whatever we hear. We do our research, we study things out, and we see what matches up with reality. And in my case, I'm seeing what matches up with Scripture. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Janus Project. Tune in next week and tune in later on this week for some book reviews and some more information. And I hope you guys are enjoying the content so far. And I will, Lord willing, see you next week. Please remember, like this video, subscribe, share it with a friend, and I hope to keep making these contents for you. All right, see ya.